Let's take a look at some of the benefits. There's way more benefits in learning personal injury documentation than what the average doctor actually realizes. So some of the major benefits are, and most of them, some of them doctors are mainly aware of, but it typically gives the highest value case average. It typically gives the highest case average in the chiropractic profession. And at the low end, you typically might see $2,500 per case. And at the high end, you can easily be at $5,000 or $7,000 per case. And these are just the average cases. And most of that has to do with what state you're in and the reimbursement of the state's factors like that. So it's a very lucrative way of practicing. Number two is it's the highest level of exchange of time for money. I mean, if you're going to be in your office, one of the goals from a business perspective is make the most amount of money per your unit of time. Well, what is that? Well, that's personal injury. Personal injury. We routinely have doctors that make $100 per visit or even $150 per visit. That's pretty routine compared to the national average in chiropractic. Not just personal injury, but everything included is $42. So you can see $42 versus $100 or $150. So you're easily making more than 2 times as much typically when you do personal injury. So it's a huge value for your time. Personal injury attorney referrals. You have to know really good documentation if you expect to get referrals from attorneys. It shows how the average attorney loses over $200,000 a year. Most people are not aware of this. Most chiropractors are not aware of this. Most attorneys aren't aware of this. The average attorney loses over $200,000 a year with bad documentation from their doctors. That's a lot of money. And I'm talking about attorneys who only see 2 to 3 cases a month. So if you got an attorney seeing 10 cases a month and he's getting bad documentation, he's up to losing $1 million easily a year. Well, that becomes very important if you know how to stop that from happening. You become a tremendous source for referrals. Stops attorneys from asking for cross referrals. I've never had attorneys say, hey, you send me one, I'll send you one. Now that happens when the attorney's not educated. So if the attorney's not educated, that's the game they'll play. But as soon as the attorney is educated in how the documentation really works and the quality of documentation they're getting, that stops happening. And the reason it stops happening is because they pretty much know you're the only one that can get them that type of quality of documentation that's going to get them a 3-to-1 or greater injury award. That's why. So that becomes a very important factor. Let's see, medical doctor, personal injury referrals. This is how you'll get referrals from medical doctors. Everything about medical doctors is science. They already have a negative perception of chiropractic. So the profession won't win medical doctors over. You individually have to. And the category of how to do that is with the science of the 3 phases of healing documentation. That's what they understand. That's what they respect, and that's what they appreciate. That's the key to getting referrals from medical providers. So establishes the need for care, keeping the patient. Sometimes doctors have trouble keeping patients. The insurance company takes them out from care or something like that. Well, it establishes the need for care. When you have the documentation, it establishes the need for care. If you don't have the documentation, to be honest with you, the patient should be taken out from under care or payment, third-party payment should be stopped. In other words, you should have the documentation to establish the need for care. In other words, get paid. You should have that documented. Well, that's what this does. Get your bills paid. It stops attorneys from asking to cut your bill. Now, the reason that happens, again, is when you have what's called high sensitivity, high relevancy documentation, it will give the attorney, or it should give the attorney, at least a 3-to-1 injury award or greater. And you'll find when the attorneys are getting 3-to-1 injury award or greater, they're pretty happy with that, and that's when they stop asking you to cut your bill. So an educated attorney who's getting a 3-to-1, getting good documentation, getting a 3-to-1 ratio or better, stops asking for you to send them one, all that, and stops asking you to cut your bill. And those are the big problems that most chiropractors have when they don't know high sensitivity, high relevancy documentation. Their documentation can't create a 3-to-1 or greater in medical bills, so the attorney has to ask you to cut your bill. And of course, once that happens, you're not very valuable. And so why should he refer you any clients? He shouldn't. And so they don't. That's how it works. Let's see, it stops fraudulent insurance-based IMEs. Again, if you got the documentation to support the need for care, it stops the IMEs, or it's a real bad position for the insurance company because it's called bad faith. That just happened to one of my doctors recently. They tried to stop care, and he went and showed them the documentation and said, why the care was needed, and he had it all. He had the documentation, he had it quantified, he explained the 3 phases of healing, and he flat out just said, you stop payment, that's called bad faith. And they turned right around and said, you go ahead and keep treating them. Stop fraud allegations, that's real important. That's real important. There's the fraud that you treat people that aren't, you bill for services you didn't do. That's a type of fraud. Well, that's on you. There's a type of fraud where you bill for patients you haven't seen. Well, that's on you also. Those are the 2 most common types of fraud. Third type of fraud that most chiropractors aren't aware of, just a couple other types of fraud, is actually not having the documentation to support the billing. That's actually fraud. Most chiropractors aren't aware of it. Or, and here's another big one, is when the chiropractor has it's very obvious if the notes were subpoenaed that he's treating the personal injury patients significantly different than the Medicare and cash patients. That's fraud. So, but again, that's on you. How to write narrative report. Now, the reason that's so important is that's the most important document for the injury award for the attorney for your potential referrals. That's why that's so important. How to testify in court. That's high demand. If you know how to testify in court, so if you know how to get the documentation, you know how to put it together, and you know how to explain it to a jury, you are the most valuable person to that personal injury attorney. And not many people can do that. There's very, very small number of doctors that can do that. Medical doctors don't like to do it at all. And most chiropractors don't like to do it. Even chiropractors that practice personal injury, they don't like to go to court. And they're not trained or knowledgeable in going to court. But if you know how to document and you're willing to go to court and you know how to go to court, that's the epitome of value. You will be unbelievably valuable, and you'll be way above the crowd when you know how to go to court. And of course, we teach that. High personal injury market. There's little competition. Now, there's a lot of doctors that'll say they do personal injury, but that's not right. 80% of them, 90% of them, they'll just take the case. They don't, for the money, they don't know how to document. They don't know how to do narrative reports. They don't know how to do impairment ratings. They don't know how to testify. So the vast majority of them don't. And then you look at the 5% who really study personal injury, and then you'll really find out of that 5%, about 80 to 90% of them miss about 50% of the documentation. That's really what happens. And so every time we do these presentations, I get chiropractors that have been to different seminars, et cetera, and they come in and typically, I'll say on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you know personal injury? and they'll come in and say all 8, 9, or 10, because they went to a Croft seminar or whatever. And within a few days of the seminar, and we start getting into the nitty gritty and the details of personal injury, they usually confide 2 days later and say, you know what, I thought I was good, but after seeing all your material, I'm pretty much like a 3. And that's the reality of it. I've seen that over and over. And the point being is there's very little to no competition at this level. There's not. There's a few people that think they are, but once you actually show the attorney how it all comes together, the documentation, the high sensitivity, the high relevancy documentation, how it's all assemblated and put together in a narrative report to tell the story to support the injury award, and then know how to go to court and deliver all that information sequentially where it totally makes sense to an 8th grade educated jury. That I'd say there's less than 3% of the chiropractors in the United States that actually know how to do that. It's unbelievably small. The great news is it's just for you to go out and get it. Now, the only problem after you know it is you definitely have to know marketing, because they're not looking for you. Attorneys aren't looking for chiropractors. So you definitely have to know marketing. And of course, we go into detail on how that works. But these are the major benefits of personal injury, and it's definitely worth adding a component. Now, I don't necessarily recommend only having a personal injury case, because if a law changes, you're in real trouble. So I recommend treating all patients: cash, major medical, Medicare, personal injury, workers' compensation, but just having a higher percentage of personal injury cases. And that'll significantly increase your dollar per visit, and certainly leverage your time for money. I remember I have one client, he only sees about 120 patient visits a week, and he collects about $700,000 a year. That's it, personal injury. So that's how it's done.